Okay, so welcome everyone again for the presentation by Andrew Doyen, who is visiting us from Australia, where she's currently a lecturer in Melbourne, where she did her PhD. She did a master's degree in planning from UBC, so she has a Vancouver base as well. And you've worked a number of years in various research capacities, and I'm sure you'll tell us a bit more about your work experience, so I won't go through it all. Andrea today is going to talk about implementing sustainability in the built environment. So welcome.
All right, thank you. And thanks everyone for having me. The title of my presentation is Implementing Sustainability in the Built Environment. So really just thinking about how do we actually bring thinking about nature and thinking about sort of nature-based solutions, but also thinking about sustainability and adaptation within sort of the built environment that is our cities. So I've been asked to give a short introduction to myself, talk about some current research I'm doing, some future research, and then talk about my teaching philosophy, and then open up to any questions. Most of you may not know, but this was me last week. I was on a family trip cycling around the Southern Alps in Austria. So happy to be here, but also a little bit sort of all over the place at the moment. I also want to sort of, before I get into my presentation, acknowledge the fact that we're on traditional Coast Salish territories, and also I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land I live and work on in Australia. One of the things I think is really interesting too about sort of acknowledgement of territories, we say here in Australia, in Canada. In Australia, we talk about acknowledgement of country. So there's just different ways that we think about that, but I think it's really important that we sort of recognize where we are. So, introduction. So, I'm a French Canadian who lives in Australia. So a number of people already this morning have asked me about my name. So it's Andréane Doyen, otherwise Andréane Doyen, also fine. Then fast forward many, many years. I did both my Bachelor of Arts and my Master of Planning at the University of British Columbia. So spent many, many years out at UBC on the other side of town here. Then I worked as a researcher and a planner, both with the city of Vancouver, with the University of British Columbia, but also with the Alma Mater Society, which is the student union at UBC. I worked in a number of different roles, both more as a sort of planning practitioner, but also in a number of different research roles as well. Then I went on to do my PhD from the University of Melbourne, where I looked at sort of thinking about how might we think about planning for urban resilience from more of a small-scale, bottom-up niche perspective. So instead of thinking of resilience as something that we need to bounce back from a big shock or stress from the system, I was really interested in thinking about resilience that was something about more of a ongoing flexibility and adaptation that happens, and how might we think about that from our urban perspective, and how might we think about the role of planning and urban governance in that space. While I was sort of at the tail end of finishing up my PhD, I was approached by RMIT University, which is literally just down the road in Melbourne, to do some research for them. And then that research turned into other research, and then that turned into a lecturing position. So in Australia, we have lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, and professor. So different sort of titles, but essentially a lecturer is about an assistant professor level. I also sort of got, in terms of sort of a little bit more about me. So as I was saying, I'm a French Canadian, so I was born in Quebec, but I actually grew up in small town Ontario. My family then moved to Alberta in the Rockies, and then I came to BC. So I spent about 10 years based out of Vancouver before moving on to Australia. During my undergraduate degree, which was, again, a Bachelor of Arts, which might be the only one in the room that has a BA, but I focused on I did double major on sociology and Asian studies. So I spent quite a bit of time in China during my undergrad and did 2 study abroad programs there studying Mandarin, but also did quite a bit of traveling. During my master's, I did field research in Indonesia. So I spent a summer there studying Bahasa Indonesia, and then I went back to do field research, looking at sort of the impact and implication of migrant workers on Karawang, West Java. So Karawang is sort of in the peri-urban fringe of Jakarta, and I was looking at how sort of the migrant populations were affecting sort of, from a spatial, economic, and social perspective, the people who and the sort of spaces around there. I also spent quite a bit of time in Singapore during and after my master's degree. I did quite a bit of conference attendance in Singapore, but I also was a teaching assistant for a traveling studio where it was a joint program with the National University of Singapore and University of British Columbia, where we had students from both institutions come to Vancouver, and then we all went to Singapore. So I did that for a couple of years. I'm now based in Melbourne in Australia. During my PhD, I oddly enough ended up doing quite a bit of research for my thesis in the United States. And then also throughout my PhD, I became really sort of involved with a particular research network that's based out of the UK and Europe. So just to kind of give a sense of where I've been and where I am now. And now I guess to the meat of the presentation, current research. So kind of wanted to talk about three sort of things, different, I guess, areas of research that I'm either currently involved in or exploring in different ways. The first is thinking about urban experiments and niche innovation, particularly when we're thinking about how do we move towards a more sustainable future. Governing urban sustainability transitions, so really thinking about, again, this idea of urban sustainability, but much more interested in sort of the processes of how we get there. And then as well, looking at the building and planning systems and the role of both building and planning in helping us or inhibiting us to achieve a more sustainable urban future. So as well, I thought this might be an opportunity to teach some of you, maybe all of you, a bit about how things work in Australia before I get into sort of the research I've been doing. So just very generally, Australia, like Canada, has 3 tiers of government. We have federal, state, and local. The purple sort of color up there is Victoria, which is where Melbourne is and where I am based. What's interesting, or what's kind of unique from a Canadian who lives in Australia's perspective, is where each different sort of level of legislation and involvement in urban affairs takes place. So the building code, the National Construction Code, is actually something that happens at the federal level. So unlike in Canada, where we have sort of the National Construction Code or the building code, but then it's really the provinces that enact it, it actually stays at the federal level in Australia. And then the planning system is actually done at the state level. So it's not done, it is implemented at the local government level, but all sort of major strategic and statutory, so all sort of long-term and regulatory planning decisions are actually set out at the state government level. And then the local governments just implement and sort of go through both building and planning applications. What's also quite unique about Australia, again, from my perspective, is that we have a planning minister. So we have planning that happens at the state level, and then we have a minister. So we have a politician who's in charge of planning, which blew my mind when I moved there. And I found it really interesting because my students can't imagine a world without a planning minister when I tell them about how things work in Canada. So just wanted to give you a sense of that sort of the environment with which planning and building takes place, and where, again, the sort of the decisions and the processes take place within these sort of levels of government. So finally, sort of in terms of the research context with which I'm going to talk to you about today is looking at how are we, or how are we not, implementing sustainability in the built environment within Australia. So currently, sort of building code requirements in Australia are sort of significantly failing to meet any sort of requirement for us to actually have a low carbon future. Australia, across sort of the developed Western world, is severely lagging in terms of its sustainability outcomes, particularly when we're thinking about housing in the built environment. So as a result of this sort of inaction, or these sort of really, really terrible sort of low requirements we have sustainability advocates coming together with planners who are trying to sort of use planning, and in particular sort of the land use planning system, to try to fill some of the gaps that the building system is sort of leaving open in delivering more sustainable outcomes. We also are seeing architects sort of trying to also think about how they might implement sustainability much more from a design and development perspective. So really the research that I'm going to talk to you about today is about looking at how have sort of more bottom-up actors have been working towards filling these gaps left by higher levels of government to actually move us towards a low carbon future. The caveat, though, is that there's still a number of problems with the planning system, particularly within the Victorian context. And in particular, we're seeing a lack of sort of leadership and innovation at the state government level. So again, state governments where planning decisions are made, and we're seeing local government and non-government actors really trying to push for change, but a lot of sort of resistance that's happening at the state level, and then we're having resistance at the federal level for the building system. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about two different case studies, two different examples of different actors who are trying to actually sort of encourage change in the system and really sort of move towards implementing sustainability in the built environment. The first is the Council Alliance for a Sustainable Built Environment, otherwise known as CASB. So CASB is an alliance of local governments within Victoria who came together to advocate for a more sustainable future. And in particular, again, as I was saying, thinking about how can the planning system help to fill these gaps that exist. And the other one is Nightingale Housing. So this is one taken on by a group of architects. So we're seeing sort of an alternative housing model that's being developed, again, in response to this current housing market we have in Victoria. So for the CASB project, this was something that I did with three other colleagues, Trevess Moore, Susie Maloney, and Joe Hurley. And we did this research in partnership with the Australian Communities Foundation, the Municipal Association of Victoria, and of course with CASB. So for the larger project, we looked at a number of different aspects. We looked at CASB, we looked at planning appeals, and we did some sort of policy analysis as well. But the part that I was sort of responsible for leading was thinking about how might we evaluate CASB and all the work they've done. In particular, we started to think about a fact that we could see CASB as an urban experiment, but it's an urban experiment that's been going on for a really long time. So could we in fact evaluate CASB as an urban experiment over a 20-year period? And in particular, we were really interested in investigating their role in shifting practices across local governments to improve the delivery of a more sustainable built environment. And sort of when we were trying to come up with ways to think about how we might do this, I spent a lot of time reading and a lot of times trying to come up with a way to do this. And then on my desk fell this paper by Litteritz et al. That was essentially that. It was 28 different authors came together to propose an evaluative scheme for thinking about how do we know urban experiments actually have impact? How do we know that they've actually helped us move towards a more sustainable future? So we decided as well as part of this research that we would actually sort of test and use the Litteritz et al. Framework and hope to respond to them as well. This research is also situated within the sort of the larger body of research that would be known as governing urban sustainability transitions. So sustainability transitions is a field of research that originally came out of Europe, primarily in the Netherlands, and then it sort of blossomed throughout Europe and the UK. And sustainability transitions as a field of research is really interested in influencing the speed and trajectory of change towards a more sustainable future. So people who get into this area of research are really interested in studying how change happens, but also in influencing change. And then sort of thinking about it from an urban perspective is where sort of I'm sort of more interested in as a planner. I have a particular interest in cities, but also I have a particular interest in issues of politics and governance. And again, as I was saying, the processes to how we move to a more sustainable future. So no need to sort of get through all that, but I just wanted to sort of, you guys to know where I was situating this work. And if you have any questions about this literature, happy to answer later. So the tentative evaluative scheme for appraising sustainability transitions experiments is the actual title of this framework by Litteritz et al. Lots going on here, but really sort of the important things to point out is that sort of there's 4 columns. What they're interested in is what was generated. What are the outputs of the urban experiment? What were the outcomes and what was accomplished? How was it completed? What was the process to this? And then the inputs, what was invested? So really thinking about these 4 questions, and then there's a number of sub-dimensions in terms of figuring how you would answer this. But again, this idea of these 4 logical steps, these 4 ways that you can investigate, was their impact? So the first one, what was generated? Well, for CASB, actually quite a lot. So starting in the late 1990s, we have a group of local government actors who came together to develop an informal network on sustainability. So you had these people who were working in different local governments who knew that they could do better, that they wanted to do better, but didn't really know how because they were alone. It might be also interesting to note here that there are 79 local governments across Victoria, and across metropolitan Melbourne, there are 32 different local governments. So it is quite a fragmented place. Also in Australia, we do not have any form of metropolitan governance. We are one of the few OECD countries not to have any level of sort of metropolitan governance or government. So there's not much to help local governments come together. But in spite of all that, we actually had local governments actors coming together. So they came together informally, and then the first thing they did after they started meeting for a couple years was they actually developed the Sustainability Design Scorecard. So they developed a scorecard that planners could use in local governments when they were appraising planning applications, so that they could actually sort of go through and see if there was merit, if the development that was being proposed would actually sort of check any boxes when it came to sustainability. Not long after that, they also developed the Sustainability Tools for Environmental Process Strategy, STEPS. So while SDS was more for commercial buildings, STEPS became more for residential buildings. Then, a few years after that, we actually have a formal advocacy group that is created. So we went from kind of an informal gathering of people who cared to all of a sudden now making it formal and inviting more people. You know, if you too care about implementing sustainability built environment, come along. And within that process, they evolved more and they developed a new tool, the SDAP, the Sustainability Design Assessment in Planning Processes. And this began to be used by more and more councils across, originally Metro Melbourne, and then in some rural and regional councils as well. Then, in sort of the early 2010s, CASB, as an actual sort of institution, as a formal organization, was created, so the Council Alliance for a Sustainable Built Environment. What the development of an actual formal named organization meant, that it meant they were a real thing and they had a bit more presence in this space as well. What CASB then went on to do as well is they began to advocate to the state government to actually implement and to actually have legislation changed. So again, thinking about that statutory and strategic planning decisions are set at the state level, that means local governments have no ability, no power to create any laws, none whatsoever. They are completely beholden to the state government. So if they want to put any sort of legislation or regulations around sustainability in the planning or building process, they do not have the right to do that. All they can do is advocate for that change to be made. And they did, kind of. 6 councils came together and they advocated for many years, and eventually the state government approved the Local Planning Policy Clause 22.05, Environmentally Sustainable Design. So this meant we now have 6 local governments in Victoria who now have the legislative ability, they have the power that any development application that goes through their council, the developers have to meet these sustainability guidelines, which is very, very incredible from the sort of an Australian Victorian, I guess, context. What that meant as well is it meant that this could happen, and now we have more local governments coming on and asking for this to be gazetted into their policies as well. And within that, they also developed yet another scorecard, the Built Environment Sustainability Scorecard, BESS, which is now being used by over 30 different councils across Victoria, including some of those that have sort of this gazetted policy as well. So I think this quote really sort of highlights what was generated. What CASB and what sort of people who are involved in this space are seeing is they're talking about how they see a tipping point. There are enough people and enough local governments across Victoria who care about sustainability in the built environment, and this isn't going to go away. So this is a quote from one of the original founders of CASB. So really sort of seeing that this is something that's deemed not just as a sort of niche thing off to the side, but something that's becoming more and more important to more people. So how did they do this? How did they sort of go from being an informal mishmash of sort of local government workers to becoming this force to be reckoned with, this formal institution? One of the things that these early sort of actors did is they were really about connecting different people together, but also trying to empower different people who are working in local governments. And the idea as well was to sort of connect people and empower them, but also to change cultures and practices around development decisions within the planning context. They were really interested, and they sort of have done quite a good job of actually trying to change the structures and standards, thinking about the planning schemes, the policies and regulations to influence outcomes that are actually leading towards a more sustainable development, and in doing so, sort of advocating for change with the higher levels of government. And then they actually did that, right? So through ongoing advocacy and submissions to the government, they're now influencing state strategy and action. And I was at a meeting a few weeks ago with the Inner Melbourne Climate Adaptation Network, And it was mostly local government actors who were there interested in how do we implement sustainability, but also climate adaptation in the built environment. And there was a few people there from the state government. And it was very clear that the state government understood if they wanted to do anything in this space, they had to be consulting with CASB. 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. So that's pretty great. How was it completed? It was really about sort of people who really cared. So you have key actors that sort of worked across different councils as knowledge brokers and advisors, and sort of were there to connect to anyone who wanted to sort of know more about this stuff. There was also a number of different local consultants that helped local governments develop their skills and capacity when it came to sustainability. Of course, the development of different tools, scorecards, and policies really became useful, but also a consistent language. When they first started doing this work, the environmental officers and the planning officers didn't speak the same language. They didn't know how to talk to each other about these sorts of things, and now they do. And really importantly was actually giving the network a name. CASB exists as a thing, and that was really important. And finally, what was invested? How did they actually sort of get to this point? Again, as I was saying, the people made a really big difference. So the commitment of people who had relevant professional skills and experiences was really important. We have two local governments in particular, the city of Moreland and the city of Port Phillip, who were really strong advocates from day one. You have the Municipal Association of Victoria, who sort of held these initial sort of informal meetings and then went on to host CASB and give them office space. And then in 2012, they were able to appoint a coordinator through funds from the member councils. So as I was saying, there is now over 30 councils who are members to this, which again sort of adds to more investment that can go back into the work that CASB is doing. So the case of CASB really sort of for us highlights the importance of networks and building capacity across councils, and for us mobilizing sort of new tools and policies and programs and things like this. Again, remembering that we have 79 councils across the whole state that have no actual way to connect with each other unless they create these ways to connect with each other. Again, we have the importance of key actors, and in particular, we have sort of specific mayors and planning officers that really sort of came out with this. But for us as well, we started to think about that this case also raises questions over organizations and actors who kind of yo-yo in and out of informal and formal positions. So technically, these actors were they were formal, right? They worked for government. They were public servants. And yet, for a lot of times, they weren't actually working like or acting like public servants. They were acting like grassroots organizations who wanted to sort of change the system. So what does it mean when we have sort of actors playing multiple roles at different times? When we think about going back to the urban experiment literature, one of the things we found was that the current literature tends to sort of define or conceptualize urban experiments. They don't really think about time or how things can happen over time, something that is ongoing. We found that to be quite limiting for sort of our case study. And in particular, Sanders et al. Came up with 5 different variations. They did a systematic literature review on how urban experiments are discussed in the literature. And we really found that sort of CASB had both elements of niche, something that was much more of sort of a bottom-up intervention that happened often in much more protected spaces, but also grassroots, something that was a bit more outside of the system, trying to sort of change things. So we really sort of then began to sort of categorize CASB not just as sort of a niche or sort of grassroots experiment, but something that was evolving, something that sort of, because we have sort of the orientation, the emphasis, and actors, they're constantly being dynamic, and the different ways that they're trying to engage in change and change the system are evolving as well. So it became quite limited to think of them as only one type of experiment. So again, we have this idea of yo-yoing that comes back between 2 types of experiments, depending on when they saw the most benefits. Sometimes they would gauge quite politically and quite sort of publicly against the state government, and other times they pull back and develop new tools, develop new processes, network. And sort of it's again this idea of figuring out what works when. And then finally, responding to literates et al., which was also one of the things that these authors put out in their paper. They said, we want people to respond to us and tell us what you think. Well, we found that the framework, while had a number of really good elements to it, it was limited in the sense that it assumed that your experiment was carefully designed, that it was almost sort of, even if urban experiments are meant to be experiments that happen in real world laboratories where society is the laboratory, the way that they kind of talked about them, they were still quite carefully designed. And we found CASB was a bit more sort of organic as opposed to sort of designed. We also sort of found that sort of the capacity to sort of capture niche regime dynamics, so thinking about the tension or relationships between local government and state and even federal government over time was not sort of quite easily captured. So in particularly within sort of a changing political and sort of policy environment, that wasn't something that could be captured within their framework. And in particular, the gazetted clause, the legislation that certain councils now have to sort of make developers implement sustainability, it actually had a sunset clause. So it was supposed to end at the end of 2017, yet that clause still exists, but we have a state election coming up at the end of this year, so we actually don't know what's going to happen. Moving on to the next case study. So the next one is called Nightingale Housing. So the idea of this research is to present a thorough investigation of Nightingale Housing, which is an alternative housing model, but also to contribute to literature on the evaluation and uptake of niches. So again, niches thinking about this sort of small-scale, bottom-up intervention or innovation that is trying to sort of encourage and sort of disrupt sort of a change in the system. So actually trying to move things into a more sustainable sort of future. So again, the literature with which this study is situated in is again within the sustainability transitions literature, but really now focusing much more on niches. So thinking about innovation and experimentation and this idea of trying to challenge the incumbent system, challenge the status quo. Within this, strategic niche management and niche protection are really sort of often talked about, the fact that niches sort of are able to challenge the incumbent system because they have some sort of protection. They either have some funding, or they have sort of access to tax breaks or protected policy spaces, or sometimes even just actual physical spaces. Although we will see that Nightingale Housing had none of those things. Within sort of the niche literature, we're also seeing an increasing example of niches within the built environment, in particular thinking about housing. And then finally, there is a recent but growing body of literature on thinking about how do we evaluate niches. So again, this idea going back to the urban experiments that we used for the CASI project, how do we know that the niche actually sort of has had change? But also, what is that trajectory? How might we track the movement of this niche? So Nightingale Housing was originally developed in 2007 by a group of what we call as concerned architects. So we have a group of 6 architects that came together who were really upset about the state of the building industry in Australia. And again, remembering that sort of we build some of the worst houses in the Western developed world in Australia. We don't have insulation, we don't have double pane windows, we don't have basements, it goes on and on. So they wanted to come together and they wanted to change that. They wanted to show by doing that you could build better housing. And that better housing didn't have to come with a lot of compromises. It didn't have to be more expensive, didn't have to be you didn't have to give up things. So they bought a piece of land together, these 6 architects. And the idea was they wanted to build something and show people that it could be done. And eventually, in 2013, the Commons, which is the name of this first building, which is the photo there, was completed. And the goal of this development was to provide sustainable, affordable, livable, and socially engaged higher density housing. This building is 40% better in terms of sustainability outcomes than what the building code in Australia states housing needs to be. And it went on to win a number of local, national, and international awards. What's interesting about the approach they took here is they took an approach of sort of scaling back. So a lot of the finishes in this building are actually quite sort of, I guess, a bit rougher. All the units only have 1 bathroom. The units don't have in-suite washing. So if you want to wash your clothes, you go to the rooftop garden and do it together. There's this idea of socially engaged housing. How can we create opportunities for people who live in this apartment to actually create a sense of community? And how can we do it while still providing a sustainable and affordable, livable outcomes? What's interesting about this is Nightingale Housing, for all intents and purposes, meets so many of the definitions around what is a niche. What is a niche in terms of sustainability transitions literature, except for one major thing. They've done it without any sort of protection. Each step of sort of this alternative housing model was taken within existing constraints of sort of the regime of the political system, of the planning and building system. They bought the land at market value. They didn't get any sort of tax breaks. They didn't get any help from the government. They had to go through standard planning applications. They had to go through traditional means for financing. They just had to go to a bank. They had a roadblock. So if, again, remember, 2007 is when they got together, and the building was completed in 2013. What happened in the middle? The global financial crisis, which meant that they were no longer be able to finance this building on their own. So they ended up approaching an ethical developer called Little Giants to work with them. So the Commons is actually a Little Giants project and not a Nightingale housing project. They did get, well, I wouldn't say this is protection, but the local government, so this is Moreland City Council, which we heard of earlier, who are quite sort of strong sustainability components. They sort of, planning application, while it was standard, the sort of council approved quite a lot of amendments. In particular, the Commons has no parking spaces in the whole building, which is very, very rare to have zero parking, and the first building of its kind in Australia. So when I was starting to think about, well, how do you track the story? How do you track the narrative of the Nightingale housing, and to see sort of how did it go from being this one-off building to now, as you'll see, a series of buildings across, so not just Melbourne, but across the country and beyond. We're starting to look at different ways that this can be done. Unlike with CASB, that we this sort of evaluative scheme sort of fell in my lap, we actually went through a number of different processes and a number of different ways to evaluate Nightingale. And I'm just going to tell you about one today that I think does the best job of providing a really clear narrative of how Nightingale housing has actually grown. And this is a conceptual visualization of 5 mechanisms for acceleration of urban transitions and how they can contribute to systemic change. And again, this is the actual title that these authors have created. But really what we're going to think about is thinking about how does something go from being replicated, how does partnering help something grow, upscaling, instrumentalizing, and embedding. So how do we move up through that S-curve to go from something that is niche to something that is sort of a bit more sort of mainstream to being fully embedded in the way that we understand the building and planning systems. So now there is a series of Nightingale apartments. So we started off with the Commons, and then this year, Nightingale 1 was completed. But there are now a number of different live projects. You have Nightingale 2, 3, Nightingale Fremantle, a village which is actually made up of 7 different buildings, and then in Brunswick East. They also developed the Nightingale housing as sort of a nonprofit to manage this model. So this means that there's now an institution called Nightingale Housing. And this means that it's an institution, or sort of again, a nonprofit that holds information and helps people who are interested in this. Architects can formally apply for a license. So if you are a licensed Nightingale architect, you then have the right to design a Nightingale house. So there are over 20 licensed architects across Australia, and there are about 17 licensed projects at different phases of development. We're also seeing these spread not just from Melbourne, but also to different states and internationally. So we're seeing examples in Western Australia, New South Wales, and also New Zealand. More recently, Nightingale Housing has developed a Nightingale Village. So they actually have a whole sort of area of land in Moreland again, where there's going to be 7 different buildings that bring together these core principles that they have. Finally, we're also seeing other developments that aren't licensed at all Nightingale, borrowing different elements. And these are now seen as quite marketable elements as well. In terms of partnering, in terms of how Nightingale Housing was able to grow, a really, really big part of Nightingale Housing is this idea of sharing knowledge and processes. So all the sort of information they got, everything they learned from the Commons was then used to design and develop Nightingale 1. And what they learned from Nightingale 1 goes into Nightingale 2 and 3, and on and on and on. So the licensed developments have access to IP, they have access to financing, and they have access to a list of potential buyers. So when you become a licensed architect, you have access not just to information, but a number of other things as well. Transparency becomes a really, really important sort of part of their sort of guiding principles. So we're thinking about sustainability, affordability, livability, and engaged communities, but transparency is also really, really important to them. And this quote here by Jeremy McLeod, which is the lead architect for Nightingale Housing, I think is really sort of interesting and really sort of shows this. If you are generous with your IP, it forces you to go out and find new solutions. It encourages you not to rest on your laurels. It also encourages generosity with our colleagues. People return the favor. The best way we can do that best way we can have impact is to make it easy as possible for other architects to be able to take what we know and improve on that. They're not precious about their information. They want more people to build better houses. They want more people to live in better houses. And as a result of that, they want to share their information, and they want you to share their information with them. When we're starting to see sort of that uptake in that S-curve and see more impact, we're seeing also a much sort of a significant increase in terms of the attention and knowledge of this from the general public. If you type in Nightingale housing in sort of your Google search engine, thousands and thousands of things will now come up. It is something it's constantly written about in local newspapers, national newspapers, and things like that. We're also seeing different ways people are sort of supporting or getting involved with this. There is now a wait list of over 5,000 potential buyers for new Nightingale projects. And again, we only have 17 projects that are currently licensed. We have over 5,000 people who will want to live potentially in these areas. Originally, sort of the Nightingale sort of model, post the Commons, have never had to rely on a developer. They've been able to develop the buildings themselves through angel investors and not have to deal with a development company. Property owners are now able to work and partner with Nightingale, just sort of instead of having to go through different types of, I guess, buying and selling of land. People are working together to create these opportunities. And of course, architects who become licensed through this model are also helping to support more of these being built. When we're starting to think about sort of the final step of it truly being embedded in and changing, revolutionizing the housing industry in Australia, we're not quite there yet. When we talk about instrumentalizing, Gorison and all who developed sort of this evaluated sort of this scheme to think about niche acceleration, they really sort of have a focus on a finance that kind of comes right at the end. So we have initially, resources were very, very limited to who was involved. Again, we have these 6 architects who bought a piece of land on their own. When Nightingale Housing became a nonprofit, became an entity, it also allowed them to bring in and to manage resources and expertise that helped to sort of further sort of establish what they were doing. And then this year, the state government awarded them $100,000 to help educate others. And particularly, the money is meant to be used to capture the learnings from these developments so that more people could learn from it. But even bigger is the announcement of the creation of a $300 million fund to provide finance for future projects. So we have a venture capital fund that has said that we want to raise this kind of money to support Nightingale Housing, which means Nightingale Housing will never have to go to a bank ever again to build their projects. It's still sort of working itself out, but it's pretty exciting. As I was saying, Nightingale Housing hasn't sort of shifted or revolutionized the entire housing industry yet, but what we are seeing is people are taking notice. They are sort of more and more becoming a force to be reckoned with, and we are seeing changes in the way that people are thinking about housing within the Australian context. So again, we do see Nightingale being as an example where we are starting to see an influence in implementing sustainability within sort of the urban development context. We're moving from something that was more bespoke, thinking of sustainable housing that was a one-off, to actually thinking about it being developed on a neighborhood scale. We're also seeing as best practices keep shifting, things keep getting better, and there's just this momentum that's taking place. We're also seeing Nightingale Housing being part of a larger conversation that's about sort of change the nature of what home means. What is a home, and what do we really need in our homes? Like with Cassidy, we see the importance of key actors and a particular sort of drive and passion that sort of helps people stay in this. We also see, again, the importance of partnering and transparency to help grow Nightingale Housing as a niche. In terms of research, though, we're finding that more research needs to be done to better understand the differences between protected niches and unprotected niches. What's the difference? What does it mean? And also, if we can find out more about these differences, it might help us to think about different approaches to niche acceleration and niche supports that can then help sort of policy and sort of government people to think about how we might support different niches in moving towards a more sustainable future. So now moving on to future research. 3 areas here, quite, I guess in some ways similar, but just sort of growing on the work that I've been doing. So first looking at sustainable housing transition, governance, power, and justice, and then sort of finishing off with the role of planning. So with Dr. Travis Moore, who I've been doing quite a bit of work with at RMIT, we have a book deal from Palgrave Macmillan to look at, or the book title is called A Transition to Sustainable Housing, Progress and Prospects for the Low Carbon Housing Future. I guess the aim of this book and sort of our book proposal is we have the technology, we have the design, we know the science, and yet we aren't building the houses that we truly need for us to meet the targets we need in terms of sort of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So the book is really going to focus more on presenting where we're currently placed for sustainable housing transition and what needs to happen if we are in fact going to meet these targets. The book is also going to present a comprehensive discussion around sustainable housing performance, policy development, and outcomes. So really thinking about sustainable housing, not from a technology or architecture perspective, but much more from a governance and policy and legislation perspective. I also see, I guess, housing as a really interesting system or sort of industry to think about sustainability in the built environment, because housing affects so much of what we do. Where our housing is depends on how we get around. What sort of things we have in our house determines sort of how connected we feel to place. So there's lots of things that I think we can do when we can study housing. The first sort of governance, power, and justice sort of area of research started off with sort of a random meeting at a conference. So I was at a conference in Gothenburg, Sweden last year, and I noticed someone's name tag said he was from University of British Columbia. I got pretty excited to see another Canadian, and we started talking. He then came to Melbourne, and we sort of continued on our conversations. But what sort of our informal coffee chats were originally around was this idea within the sustainability transitions and transformations research community, justice just isn't talked about. We're starting to see power in politics as something that people think about when they're thinking about sustainability transitions, but people don't talk about and don't think about justice. And we just kind of thought that that was something that just, that wasn't on. We thought we could do something with that. So a couple weeks ago, I was in Manchester for the International Sustainability Transitions Conference, where Steve Williams and I presented our paper looking at a just systemic transition. So our goal here is to develop a new research agenda around justice within, again, the transitions and transformations community. And really sort of encouraging people to think about the fact that we need to consider the quality of a transition and question if a particular initiation or niche or sort of big push of a transition is actually just and desirable. So not just thinking about a sustainable future, but thinking about a sustainable and just future. So we situated sort of this thinking and developing a particular framework of how might you actually incorporate justice in transitions research and practice around Steve's research around the Energy Futures Lab. So the Energy Futures Lab is in Alberta, and it is a sort of a living lab type environment where they're bringing together different people from the energy sector in Alberta to think about what is the new sort of energy future for Alberta. And one of the things that came out of the work that Steve's been doing with them is thinking about issues of environmental justice. And we wanted to take that a little bit further to think about the energy systems. We had to think about the environment, and we wanted to think about the people who are involved, but also the people who aren't directly involved as well, thinking sort of beyond this idea of labor and communities, but thinking about other areas as well. Working within a Canadian context, and in particular sort of in the Alberta context, we found there was a need to also think about sort of indigeneity and Indigenous relations when we're thinking about energy systems and sustainability. As I was saying, sustainability transitions originally comes from Europe, and in Europe, they don't spend much time talking about Indigenous relations. And we found if we're going to use these theories and practices either within an Australian or Canadian perspective, we need to think about how this fits in to our understanding of a change to a more just and sustainable future. Questions of governance, power, and justice are something that I'm just really interested in. I would say I'm much more of a process person than I am a product person. I'm interested in how change happens and what that means. I'm a little bit less excited about sort of the product at the end. I want to know how it happens. I want to help it happen. So I've been doing quite a bit of work where I've been invited to sort of come along to a number of things that have been happening with sort of a number of transport planners and advocates within Melbourne. I'll start off by saying that I'm not a transport planner, and for a really long time I had kind of stayed away from transport. But again, if you have an interest in the built environment, you have an interest in housing, you have an interest in sustainability, in many ways, transport seems like a next logical step. So I haven't started doing any research around transport, but what I have been doing is having really great sort of conversations and participating in some really interesting events. So I'm part of these two research groups, the Critical Urban Governance Research Program, and the Planning and Transport in the City. We're currently developing a conversation series called Transport Ethics Conversation Series. So thinking about issues of ethics and justice when we're thinking about transport. And also I've been participating in a Talking Transport Forum to think about as well, how do we engage with, in public forums about the questions and the things that we're talking about in the academic sector beyond. Almost at the end. And one of the things that's come out, particularly around the work that we did around CASB, so the Council Alliance for Sustainable Built Environment, was thinking about, again, what is the role of planning in this space? How can planning help fill gaps that exist in the building system? So we're finding more and more that CASB and others are interested not just in sustainability, but really in thinking about climate adaptation. And again, seeking us to think about, well, where does planning fit into this space? So questions and things that have come up then is, well, we need to define the role of planning in adaptation and establish regulations and support process related to this stuff. Within the Australian context, there's not much happening here. We also sort of would say that more data needs to be collected in terms of thinking about sort of evaluation and design processes and thinking about the outcomes, right? How do we know we've actually done what we set out to do? And really sort of this need to link planning innovations to other policy outcomes. Planning doesn't exist in a vacuum, so how can we do a better job of linking different policies and regulations across this space? So a few weeks ago, I presented this to the City of Melbourne because they were interested in sort of learning more about this and what this might mean in their everyday practice. So just to wrap up, in terms of future research and things that I'd like to explore moving forward, is really thinking about the role of planning in implementation of sustainability and climate adaptation. So as a planner, obviously that's an interest of mine, but I think there's so much going on, and I want to sort of find ways that our planning system can participate in these spaces to actually lead us to a more sustainable, low carbon and just future. I think that, I'd be interested in doing this sort of stuff around built environment and housing, which I've been primarily working on, but areas like transport and energy, I think, are also areas that I would be interested and could still be asking these sorts of questions in different systems. I think it's really interesting to think about this. Barrett et al. Came out with a paper called The Ethical City. And one of the things they say is we need to be asking ourselves, whenever we see a proposed solution policy program, we need to ask ourselves, are proposed solutions addressing the interrelated problems of climate change, inequity, and inclusive governance? And those are three things that I feel are really, really important when we're looking at something, either from a policy or research perspective. Is it supporting more environmentally positive outcomes? Is it supporting equity and justice for people? And is it done in good governance concepts? These sorts of things I think are really important when we're thinking about different systems. And finally, as someone who's currently based in Australia, who is keen to come back to Canada, I'm also really sort of looking forward to contributing to planning and sustainability debates within Metro Vancouver, but also Canada more broadly. So last piece is the teaching philosophy. So I thought I'd break this up into sort of three quick categories. Briefly talk about some of the experience I've had, my philosophy, and I'm actually working on a research project on teaching that I thought you guys might like to hear about. So in terms of teaching, I've been teaching strategic planning at RMIT, both at the undergraduate and postgraduate program. So really thinking about more long-term planning and sort of governance and regional planning. I've also been teaching urban governance, again, both the undergraduate and postgraduate level. Urban studies or urban theory, I teach a course called The Urban Age to first-year undergraduate environment and planning students. I've also taught environmental theory to undergraduate students. So sustainable development, sustainable buildings, architecture, governance, I've kind of done a number of different positions, either as a teaching assistant or sort of as a lecturer in these different areas. And then I've been a thesis supervisor, both to undergraduate honors and master's thesis as well. But I guess as you'll see, it's really planning and sustainability where I've been doing a lot of my teaching. In terms of teaching philosophy, I think it's really important when you set up a course and when you set up sort of a sort of curriculum or a syllabus, that your role as a teacher is to take students on a particular journey, but also to help them through that journey, to illustrate, to show them how these different pieces fit together. I think there's a number of ways you can do that. I think you can have core themes that exist as pillars throughout your course, in addition to sort of the umbrella topic with which you're teaching. I think the reading materials becomes really important in how you sort of offer students different ways to engage with the material and the topics and themes. I think the lectures itself, how you engage with people and the information that you're giving them, and how that either fits into these other pieces. Then the assessment tasks. I think it's really, really important that the assignments that students have are connected back to the readings and the themes and the topic, and that they see the growth from one assignment to the other, and they understand their progress as well. And finally, you need to have different ways to engage with students. There isn't just sort of one way to teach, there's just not one way to learn. And I think it's important to sort of switch this up and to offer different ways. One of the things I've been doing in terms of reading materials from undergraduate students is offering them not just academic texts, but sometimes documentaries or other types of reading material that can help give people an entry point into something that is often quite complex. I won't go through these, but these are just quotes from students that I've had on my teaching evaluations in terms of, I guess, my ability to do these sorts of things. When I think about sort of course content and lecture material, though, I really think it's important to give students ways to engage with what can be sort of complex or sort of new to them theoretical concepts. So I think using my own research and showing them sort of what I've been thinking about, using case studies, using places that I've been, using film, I think is really interesting and useful. Talking to students about debates that are currently happening in the literature. There is not just one way to view something, there are many ways to view something, and that's incredibly important. I might be standing in front of the room as an expert of sorts, but I also have my own biases, and I also have my own sort of areas of research that I'm interested in. And I think it's important that we sort of unpack some of these things together. I also honestly see teaching as a privilege. I genuinely really like teaching. I'm really passionate about it. And I think it's an amazing opportunity to have students come in and you get to tell them about something that you care a lot about. And I hope as much as possible that that comes through when I am with students. I also think teaching provides a really sort of interesting and important bridge between research and practice. For a lot of the students in undergraduate and master's programs, they're not transitioning into a PhD, they're transitioning into the workplace. So what can we do as teachers, as instructors, to sort of help them through that process? But also, how can we encourage them to keep thinking and to keep reading and to use theory when they are out there practicing? I think that's really important as well. And I see sort of teaching as a way to contribute to the discipline and practice of planning. I can do research with sort of industry partners, I can do research with the government, but I also see teaching as a way to sort of influence change in the profession. I think one way that we can think about that bridge between research and practice and teaching is to get students to do different types of assessment tasks that are going to help bridge that gap. Down here in the corner where you see 42, I got my students to do mock planning submissions. So there was the new transport strategy for the city of Melbourne came out, and they were seeking submissions from the public. So I got the students to go through that process and to develop submissions as an assignment that they could then go on and hand into the city of Melbourne afterwards. What's next for Wyndham was a research project in collaboration with a local government in the west of Melbourne, and then the students presented their work back to the council. Up at the top there, the Centre for Appropriate Technology, I co-supervised 3 architecture students who worked with an Indigenous community in far north Queensland, thinking about how to develop and how to design more appropriate housing when people lived in community. And finally, this past semester, I've been working with someone from the Learning and Teaching team on a project. So the project title, which is totally sort of a learning and teaching, lots of words, is Achieving Personal and Professional Goals, Improving Student Engagement and Learning Outcomes Through Authentic Online Assessment Tasks. It's quite a mouthful, but basically, I was interested, so this course is called Governance and Planning. It's a 3rd-year planning course in the Bachelor of Planning where I currently work. The program is 4 years long. So they have, and the purpose of my course is to teach the students about the politics of planning and to tell them that planning is way more messy than they think it is. And it's a course that a lot of students enter with quite a lot of apprehension because they're not gonna learn a skill. They're not doing urban design. They're not learning how to do a planning application. We're just gonna talk about critical urban governance. And they kind of go, ugh. So I knew that, but I also knew that this was a time in their degree where we could maybe play things, we could switch things up a little bit. So the idea was to develop an alternative assessment task so they could reflect more on their learning of this complexity that is governance and planning, but also potentially they could find sort of within this alternative assessment task something that would connect them to their future professions as planners. So again, the project aim was to improve student engagement and enhance assessment and feedback practices through trial of a creative assessment task using blogs. So what the students did is for the whole assignment, the whole course, they had to create a blog, and they had different posts that they had to do throughout the semester, and they also had to comment on each other's posts throughout the semester. And the idea was for them, as I was saying, to constantly reflect and engage on what they were learning, sort of engage in peer learning as well, and to think about what it was that they were sort of then being sent out in the world to do in a couple of years. So we have all their posts. We've run some focus groups. They've completed surveys. And when I head back to Melbourne, I will then start the data analysis process within this. But informally talking to students and just reading their posts, it's been incredible to see their journey. Most of them started off this course being very apolitical. And again, as I was saying, weren't too excited about this. But at the end, we actually have sort of changing the world while staying employed. These people who are really sort of wanting to fight the good fight and seeing that planning wasn't something that meant you couldn't engage. You didn't have to be a doormat. You could be more than that. So I think it's pretty exciting stuff to see. And that's all from me.
Questions? You want to do this? You're really good at this, May. Well, I'll just, there you go.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you for your talk, Andréane. I'm Karen, and I was curious from your presentation, from the lessons that you've learned in Melbourne, is there anything that you would see as applicable and something that you would bring to Vancouver in the way that Vancouver is set up? I know you have a lot of experience in working in Vancouver as well, so having immersed in both of those systems, what would you see as something to carry over?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Good question. I guess one thing is, within the CASB, the first time I presented the CASB research at a conference, someone said, well, what's generalizable about this research? And I actually said, that's not why we did the research. We did this research much more from an advocacy perspective, where we wanted CASB's work to be acknowledged. So sometimes it's a bit tough to go, well, I know in Vancouver and in Metro Vancouver more generally, the provincial government isn't in charge of all planning decisions. We do have Metro Vancouver here and things like that. So in some ways, maybe it's not directly applicable, but this idea of continuing to do advocate research is something I'd be really interested in doing here. But in terms of learnings through sort of CASB, it is this idea if you want to actually create change in the system, the sort of the role of networking and the role of advocacy and the role of capacity building within planning is really, really important. There's some interesting research that's been done, particularly out of Griffith University, which is in Queensland in Australia, looking at the fact that planners care about urban greenery and they care about renewable energy in urban areas, but they're not taught about this stuff in their planning degrees. So they go through this sort of traditional sort of planning trajectory, and they get put out there, and they go, well, we don't really know how to deal with this. So thinking about how do we think about capacity building and new knowledges and linking different disciplines across planning, I think is still something we need everywhere to meet our sustainability targets. I think this sort of Nightingale housing is an interesting one as well, because Vancouver too struggles with housing affordability and thinking about how do you house people in different ways. And I think there's much more we could learn from sort of the Nightingale model, the way they've been able to sort of persevere through and really think about doing this outside of the system, I think is quite fascinating. I'd be interested in learning more about alternative sort of development models here and sort of looking at sort of larger research within that.
Hi. So as a natural scientist, we think a lot about experiments and experimental design. So I'm curious to know, you had mentioned that you were looking at urban development experiments. So, and particularly the design aspects. So what is it about an urban experiment? What are the design elements that go into those?
Oh, that's a big question. Thank you. So I guess one of the things that's interesting about, I guess, that body of literature is that there's this idea that if we're trying to do something different, we can call it an experiment. And depending on who you're citing and who you're reading and what part of the world, what goes into a Herner experiment changes. But there is this idea that there's something that happens that's sort of given a bit of space away from everything else to try and test things. So we call it an urban experiment, but it really could be called a pilot project. It could be called a trial, could be called sort of a number of those things. But it's this idea to try to, as much as possible, test something in real world circumstances, but remove some of the really hard bits about that and to learn from that. When people talk about urban experimentation, there's sort of a number of things that people talk about. They talk about the importance of learning by doing. So not just talking about something, but actually trying it and then reflecting and learning from it. And then using those lessons, if it is a failure or if it is a success, those are equally important into thinking about what's the next thing you need to try. So in some ways it has more in common with sort of design thinking and thinking of prototypes and moving on. As a natural scientist, probably the word of experimentation, you go, that's not an experiment. But from a social science and planning perspective, I think we use things a lot more liberally. And it's just about sort of trialing and testing and reflecting and then moving on. People often talk about as well sort of governance by experimentation. So how do you do something? How do you make decisions differently than the way you normally make decisions? And that's also called an urban experiment.
Great, thanks, Andrian, for your talk. Enjoyed hearing all about the Australian case and context. I wanted to sort of follow up on Sean's question about the transitions, specifically related to transitions literature, and your thoughts around moving from the experimentation piece into more structural relevance and systemic change. I mean, you talked in your presentation about embedding, so maybe just how you think the transitions literature is enabling that or not? Is this sort of death by pilots, or is it something that could be more structurally relevant?
Great, thanks. I guess what's interesting about the Nightingale housing with viewing it through that literature is that there isn't the sense of, well, how do you move from an experiment into the real world, because they've never had any help, they've never had any protection. So they've been experimenting, but sort of on their own, and they just keep going. So with that, one of the things we're looking at is we don't have to worry about, well, what happens when you take their training wheels off? Are they still going to be able to ride their bike? They never had training wheels. So there's differences in the types of experiments or the type of way we define things. One of the things that came out, it was just at the Transitions Conference a couple of weeks ago, was and I'm guilty of this. I love sort of looking at grassroots innovation. I love I guess maybe the David stories and the David and Goliath. I like when people are sort of trying to do different things. But sort of there is a bit of a critique within the literature that we focus too much on that. And we're not focusing enough on sort of systemic change. We're focusing on little things that might get us there. So we're thinking about transitions versus transformations, or incremental versus radical change. And there's definitely a big push within that sort of that research community to devote more attention to systemic, radical, sort of bigger step change. But at the same time, not to ignore that sometimes we need to start somewhere. In some ways, it depends people's area of research. As an urban scholar, potentially sort of to my detriment, I tend to focus more on small scale things because I like to think about things within cities and within a bounded context, whereas some of my colleagues who focus much more on energy systems think not just nationally, but internationally across lots of different things. So sometimes it depends what sector or industry you're interested in, but is there a potential that we focus too much on it? Yes, definitely. Although I guess within a planning context, I've sort of have found that a lot of governments will say we need to know it works before we agree to do it again. Or we'll fund a bigger project if we know it works. Show us it's worked somewhere else. So there is sometimes a need to actually go, look, it worked, even if it's just once.
Hi, I'm Murray. Thank you. I enjoyed your talk. One of the things you come to be very familiar with when you work in an interdisciplinary department is we all have our triggers in our disciplines. If you mention experiments, it triggers experimental design among natural scientists, definitely. That wasn't a shot. It sounded like a shot, but it wasn't a shot. And I was glad to see that you understood what that's about. But what it triggers for me, and this is how I make it not a shot, because it triggers things for me too. From a policy perspective, I think of those kinds of things as being about innovation and diffusion of innovations. And so you're looking at an innovation and seeing how it diffuses to other settings. And there's, in the way you're looking at it, to me, you're looking at it from kind of an above view of what's going on. But I'm really curious about the perspective from the potential adoption site. So what kind of incentives and disincentives there are for individuals or organizations in the potential adoption site to adopt this innovation or to modify it or to do other things with it. Are you looking at that? Is that involved with your approach to this?
In terms of the research that we did with CASB on that, I guess I only presented one piece of a larger project, but one of the things that we have been talking about in terms of moving forward with this is doing a bit more on the ground work like that. So why are people choosing to be a member of CASB? How do we know, I guess this idea again, what sort of impact is happening and how is it happening on the ground? There's also a need sort of from CASB to do that because they see that as really valuable evidence and data that they can then use to continue their advocacy work. We did sort of this research, and maybe I guess in a way that sometimes we do things. RMIT, where I currently work, it really encourages us to do a lot of sort of to balance public reports and sort of public forums with academic work. So we began first doing the public stuff, and now we're sort of going through and theorizing some of our findings. So in particular, this sort of sub-project that came out of that was really just about thinking about how do we know, we wanted to create a way to tell this story. And we found the urban experimentation literature offered that to us, but I don't think at its current set that it really is looking at sort of more of the on-the-ground instrumentalizing of that sort of thing. However, in some of the frameworks that I was trialing for the Nightingale Housing Project, there is a lot more focus on the role of actors, intermediaries, champions, and things like that. I think that sub-literature might have more to say if I would stay in the sub-literature, but also not needed to.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm not a planner, so I'm totally out of left field. I found the information about the Nightingale project quite interesting, but new construction is definitely not the only way to become more sustainable. And so I was just curious whether there's similar research going on about retrofitting, and are there similar players, are there similar dynamics in that field?
So yes, retrofitting, I agree, is completely something that we need to focus on and do more with, partly because a big chunk of our housing stock in the next 50 years is already built, so what are we going to do with it? Within the sort of Australian or Victorian context, no, there's no players like the Nightingale or no organizations that are doing that. The government, though, is much more involved in retrofitting projects, so the government does provide different grants and incentives for homeowners to retrofit their homes. I think 1 in 5 houses in Australia now have solar panels on their roofs, and there's different things like that that are really sort of pushing that side of the things. In the book, Trevess and I are going to touch on retrofit as well, and thinking about what's happening in that space and where we are and where we need to go. Again, given that we have a lot of existing housing stock. The thing with Nightingale Housing for me was it's this thing that gets talked about all the time in the news, and especially in sort of my circles of planning, architecture, and sustainability, and yet no one was writing about it. No one was doing any sort of critical research on them. So I saw this as an opportunity to sort of jump in and say, well, what is going on besides sort of the flashy headlines that we see in the newspapers? And I really wanted to know a bit more about it. And this is sort of the beginning of research on them. But for now, they're not touching retrofit. What is interesting, though, is they have thus far have only done inner city infill developments, but they have just announced, like 2 weeks ago, that they're looking at sites in small towns and in rural areas now. So still new construction, but thinking differently than they have before about where housing should be.
This happens to everybody. Thank you for your presentation. My question is a bit more basic, I guess. I wanted you to back up a bit and give your definition of sustainability and how you measure it within the context of your research. And this is a bit of a cynical question because, you know, our Prime Minister talks about sustainability and improves new pipelines, and the world talks about the importance of climate change, and yet we keep missing targets, and so we make new targets and we keep missing those targets. So I'm curious how you or advocates within, you know, these examples that you look at, do they have critical perspectives on sustainability, or are they just saying, well, let's just not do it as bad as we have been doing it, and that's makes us feel better, or that is better than, it's not as bad as it could be?
I feel like it's not a basic question. It's actually really complicated question, but thank you. So maybe just to start, CASB, I would say, are a bit more of a let's do less bad, because things aren't great in terms of the built environment. So they're going, if we could just do a little bit better, if we could just have a little bit less impact, that would help us. And they kind of go, and they feel like they can do this incremental, keep having less impact. That's a bit more of their approach, partly because they're a bit more about thinking about what is doable within the current context that they're in. Nightingale sees sustainability not just about the environment, but about people and about financial models, and they see it more of as changing the way we do and understand things, and they see sustainability as an umbrella or as a sort of place that they can situate their work in that is about, again, it's that engaged community, livability, affordability, and things like that, but also changing the financial models of how people buy homes and what that means and who they engage in the financial process. And they're really selective on who they work with in terms of working with banks or construction companies that'll have ethical sort of, I guess, approaches and philosophies and things like that. On a personal note, I feel like I'm probably supposed to have like, this is what I think, but I spent the first year of my PhD struggling with that question. And I asked students this, I'm like, what does sustainability mean to you? And then I expect them to answer within like a minute, where it took me an entire year to grapple with that, and I still wasn't happy with it. And I actually then moved on to the resilience literature, because I was like, maybe that'll help me. I'll look at socio-ecological systems, and I'll think about resilience, and I'll think about system thinking, and I'll feel more comfortable over there. And then I ended up coming back into sustainability. But for me, I guess, one of the things that's a bit hard sometimes to think about when I think about it just from a planning perspective, but when I think about it from much more from my personal perspective, I think it's not just about doing less bad, it's about doing more good. I think we should be thinking about sustainability as something that is sort of multifunctional. I think the tree is a really sort of great way to think about sustainability. The tree takes, but the tree also gives back. And I think we should be thinking about the types of interventions we make in cities, but also just in our world in general, as we can't expect something to not take anything, but they should be able to give back, and they could give back in terms of providing us with clean air, providing us with energy, but also providing us with a sense of community and home and meaning as well. And I think to think about sustainability not just from a sort of checking boxes in a quantitative environmental perspective, but also sort of widening that a bit more and thinking about, are people, is there a sense of place that exists within sort of these movements as well? What are you offering to people? So within that, I've sort of looked into, as I was saying, the resilience literature, but also regenerative design, positive development, and different types of, I guess, design disciplines as well, and thinking about what that means. It's hard sometimes in terms of the work I do. It gets to be a little bit frustrating at times because I wish people were willing to take sort of bigger steps in how they defined and imagined sort of a more low carbon, sustainable, just future. But I also see it as being part of the good work to kind of help people see things differently. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, and thanks for a great talk. I must have about 10 or 12 questions that came out of it, so but I'm not gonna ask them all. I was interested in Casby. Two things about that experiment was one is what gave rise to that? What unique factors, if any, gave rise to this phenomenon? So we're always interested in where the innovations come from. And a second question related to that, when you went through and evaluated it, you looked at certain outputs, like they set up these various checklist systems and these kinds of evaluative frameworks. And I'm wondering, when you go one step further, which is to say, well, what did all of that affect in terms of sustainable outcomes in the way the world runs? So if we looked at various indicators, if you're interested in social justice, for example, did it improve the distribution of income? Did it result in a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions? So when you look at it from that evaluative perspective, how does it stack up? And if you didn't look at those indicators, why not? And then the question I was going to just quickly sneak in too about the Nightingale housing. Has anybody done any social survey research of the people who have actually moved into this housing and asked them why they live there?
I'll answer the second one first.
Okay.
So Nightingale Housing, the Nightingale 1 as the name of the building, people who just moved in less than 6 months ago. So there will be post-occupancy evaluation studies that are done, but we don't have anything yet. The Commons, which is their sort of initial sort of project, is a bit different because it didn't end up getting developed in true Nightingale fashion because they had to rely on a developer. It's been a bit, there isn't sort of more systematic or rigorous research that's been done. There's just a lot more anecdotal stuff. They give tours in both buildings so people can go and see and ask questions and things like that. But the post-op stuff is to come. And the idea as well with the money from the state government, but also more academic interest to sort of develop that. But otherwise, not yet.
Do we know who's moved in there?
Oh, that we know, like demographics and stuff. Oh, yeah, yeah, the demographic people like me. You have definitely people from sort of late 20s, probably to sort of mid 40s, professionals. There are children. There are sort of families with children as well. There are sort of single couples and families with children, so we do have that spectrum. But for the most part, professionals who live in and sort of work in the inner city, who were interested in more sustainable and sort of alternative housing models. Also, you get the ideas with Nightingales, you get more bang for your buck. So some people were really attracted to that because for the same price, they would have gotten something not as good in the same location. But it is a bit of a self-selecting community. It's people who are interested in sustainability who are okay with the fact that you are going to share a clothesline on the top of your rooftop and see other people's clothes, and that's okay. That, you know, there are sort of play spaces that are shared. So there is a bit of a communal sustainability element to it. Also, as I was saying, there's no parking. So it's also people who either ride their bike or take public transport. And it's people who are okay living in apartments. So there's that. It's a demographic that sort of exists.
Not a very representative group of
No. And one of my colleagues, Ralph Horn at RMIT, he's been sort of looking a bit more into that. So he's one of the co-authors of the Ethical City paper. And there is that, like, yeah, and he laughs too. It's like, they all look like me. They're all white professionals who care about sustainability. So diversity, nope.
So it limits its diffusion through
It does for now, yeah. I mean, we'd be really interested in seeing if they do, in fact, move forward with some of their housing in rural areas. Would that change things? But in terms right now, no, it's pretty, yeah, the diffusion is more housing, but not necessarily more different people. First one, so different types of indicators for CASB. One of the so I guess one of the things that we did within this project is we looked at planning applications, and we looked at, so in the Victorian context, planning applications that are either not approved or approved can be objected, and then they go to the Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal, so the VCAT. So they go to the state court, and then they can be sort of appealed, and so through that appeal process. So we looked at the appeal processes of planning applications that were either approved or objected based on sustainability grounds over a 13-year period to see if there was a change in the way that decisions were made, or if there was something that we could see about, was there something there? Also, could we see an impact that the work of CASB has done to sort of limit the amount of objections and have more sort of sustainable outcomes? What we found is that we didn't find anything, but it's a lot messier. And part of that is the way that sort of the political and sort of government process works within Australia. Just because a local government thinks it's the right thing to do, they don't have the power to do anything. So a developer can object a decision, and then it goes to court. And the judges that proceed over these decisions aren't planning or land use or sustainability experts. You can have a human rights judge that looks over a planning application based on sustainability grounds. So we found it was actually quite difficult to track what sort of, we were wanting to say, look, we can show you that CASB's impacted the planning system. And in the end, we were like, meh, meh. It did in some places, but in some places we had the opposite sort of decisions that got made. So that was, unfortunately, maybe not what we wanted. In terms of thinking about other indicators, we have been relying sort of on what CASB originally were wanting from this research. So what sort of data did they want? What did they think were going to be useful? And it is difficult in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or things like that, because that we need access to data that sort of at the time we didn't have. But CASB have now come back and said, would you guys be able to look at other indicators so that we can track? The one thing we do know is that there are more sustainability consultants than there were before. That's just not CASB, that's the last 20 years of change. So we're finding it difficult to sort of separate these things. What we do know is that we now have more councils who are members. We have more councils who have a gazetted clause. We have that. And in terms of sort of the initial, what initially got this started, so again, there's 32 councils across metropolitan Melbourne. Manningham City Council, there was 2 people who moved from Manningham City Council to Moreland City Council. And they were really interested in sustainability, and they brought that over with them to Moreland. And at the time, the mayor of Moreland was sort of this, really sort of a very vocal environmental activist. And that created this sort of little window of opportunity where you had staff and sort of politicians who cared about something. And the mayor created space for these planners to sort of think about this a bit more. And that attracted other people from other councils who also thought they could do more. So so you have really key people within that. And then on the same time as that, over this period, we have a lot of inaction from higher levels of government. And in particular, different times, like our former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, who is a climate change denier. So you have sort of different times as well where local governments saw themselves as being the only ones who were doing something. And that's a story that we see a lot in the US right now, where we're seeing cities taking sort of charge where sort of higher levels of government aren't. But it really is these few people that all ended up being in the same council at the same time, and then the waves of politics.
And just related, I assume the absence of any kind of metropolitan government was a major factor as well, because if you had a metropolitan government,
Yeah, I mean, it's what we it's what we think about a lot. So there's a book launch next week actually called The Metropolitan Imperative. So Richard Tomlinson, who's from the University of Melbourne, and Marcus Spiller, who's the director of SGS Economics and Planning, which is a consultant firm, they edited a book looking at metropolitan governance and what that might mean for Australia. So myself and Martin Horak, who's actually at the University of Western, wrote a chapter looking at Toronto and Vancouver and thinking about what that might mean for the Australian case. There's a lot of discussion that's happening around the idea of metropolitan governance, especially within Melbourne and Sydney. But we have, the majority of the population lives in the cities, and it becomes something the state governments really, I guess, they don't want to lose their power, and that becomes a really complicated thing as well. But yes, if we'd actually had a way for these local governments to come together instead of them creating ways, what would that mean? But Victoria's seen as, so Harriet Bulkley and Susie Maloney separately have been writing about for the last couple of years how Victoria's actually quite this unique place where even if it is completely fragmented, we have CASBO, but we also have greenhouse alliances. So we have the Western Alliance for Greenhouse Action and the Northern Alliance for Greenhouse Action, and there's another, and the Inner Melbourne Climate Adaptation Network. So you have all these little networks that get created outside or in spite of the state government.
So it must be the only place in the world. Are there other places where there's no metropolitan government for large urban centers in Western countries?
Yeah, no, Italy has like voluntary, but otherwise Australia and New Zealand. But I love New Zealand, but it's not quite the same there. Yeah, because they don't have big cities other than Auckland. So. I think May's telling us to wrap it up. We've got a. I think we've got.
Okay, I think we got, thank you so much.